Implementing Braze can feel overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. In this video, I'll tackle the most common challenges teams face and top tips from over a decade of experience with tools like Braze and others. From strategy to execution, we'll break down key areas to help you implement Braze like a pro. Let's get started. Let's look at the first step, which is just to create a tracking plan. Now here on my right, we have a tracking plan in Google Sheets. You can also create it in Excel or Google Docs or Word or Whiteboard, it doesn't really matter. The whole point of a tracking plan is just to make a list of all the events, event properties, and user attributes that you will be sending to Braze. So in this example, this is just a SaaS product like Wistia, like a video player. We have some events, around like signups, for example, sign up completed, some onboarding events. There's, of course, events around projects like, uploading videos and deleting videos and things like that. And then for every event, there's event properties. For example, the sign up event, we have properties around first name, last name, email, how'd you hear about us, and a subscription name. And then, of course, the user attributes, which are called user traits in this document, are the same. So the tracking plan is really helpful because you can make a list of all these events. You can edit them, you can remove, you can add. And it's much easier to do it here than to do it code level. And typically things in Braze are case sensitive. So if you send an event lowercase and then another event uppercase, it's a whole different thing. So you want to get all your stuff done right in something like this, like a Google Sheets, and then send it over to Braze. So ideally you want to have your 20, 30, 40 events that your product has. You're not going to implement all 40 events. You might only implement 10, but that's okay. You have this repository of future events that you can come back to as needed. So definitely go through a tracking plan, create it, think about it, tweak it. You may already have some of this, right? If you have a tool like a Mixpanel or an Amplitude, some of this data may already exist somewhere in your company. So it's just a matter of sending it to Braze or capturing and then, integrating it somehow. But this is actually, I think, the first step because this kind of tells us all the different data that we will be sending to Braze. If you only upload emails and names to Braze, you can do that, of course, but I think it just misses out on a lot of the really powerful functionality that Braze has, which depends on events, event properties, and user attributes. One consideration here is depending on how data points work for your account, sometimes some things cost more in terms of points than not. For example, sometimes event properties can consume more data points. Generally, in my experience, it's been a matter of just sending Braze everything. So we send all the events that we care about, all the event properties we care about, all the user attributes, and the data point consumption doesn't kick in until we enable some things within the interface itself. That is, perhaps we're sending 10 event properties, but we only enable 2 of those 10 to be used in our documents. But if we ever need to, we can enable the other 8 as needed. Now, double check this with your contact. Everything in Braze is custom. It's a negotiation depending on your needs. But just a general note on how the data you send might impact your data points. Once you have your tracking plan, then we can move on to SDKs. As of course, lots of different SDKs that Braze offers. We have the web, we have Android here, we have Swift for iOS, Cordova, Flutter, React Native, Unity, Roku. You can also just send data through the endpoint. For example, the user's track endpoint. So you can send user attributes, events, event properties to this endpoint. I did this something recently with backend data, sending data into Braze. Pretty straightforward. So again, work with developers to understand what is the best way to integrate Braze into your app. Generally, you're going to have multiple SDKs. So you might have a web SDK and perhaps a backend way of tracking data. Or you may have a web, iOS, and Android, as many of my clients do. And we're tracking things across all SDKs. Of course, depending on your channels, which we're going to see in the next step, you may also have to deal with multiple SDKs nonetheless, if you want to enable push notifications and in-app notifications and other functionality. So for every SDK, your developers have to go through it. There's typically some installation of the Braze library. Then there has to be some setup, some API keys, and a few other things that are dependent on every SDK. For example, push notifications have to be enabled on iOS and Android. So there's specific code that's done for those 2 things on that element. So choose your SDKs, work with your developers to implement the data from the previous step, which is the tracking plan. The events, the event properties, and the user attributes will then be implemented through the SDK. and of course, anything specific for that SDK that might be needed to get it working. So this can be a pretty lengthy process, depending on how many SDKs you're integrating. And there's a lot of sort of little details that you have to go through in the documentation. But this is just the core technical implementation here that we have to go through before we can really start using Braze to its full potential. And just so you see here, this is the one of the endpoints for user data. And we can actually just send data here. Here's an example. There we go. So we can just send, hey, we can send some of the email attributes here. We can send some of the events. And of course, we can send some of the event properties for that specific event. We can send purchases and a few other things. So this can all be done from an endpoint perspective. So, you could really integrate Braze in some very simple manner just by sending data directly to the endpoint if that's easiest for your company. Again, we're going to see channels next, which might determine what SDKs you use nonetheless. But just so you know, there's lots of ways to send data into Braze. It's just a matter of finding the best combination for your team. Next, we have to look at channels. Now, channels are things like email, push notification, in-app messages. We have them here. Content cards, SMS, MMS, the visual version of text messages, and webhooks. So depending on what channels you use, there's also specific steps for each channel. For example, if you look at the email setup, you're going to see kind of very basic things that are needed to get email going, right? We have to get some IPs and domains for our email sending. We have to warm up the IP, which may take a few weeks. Kind of double check those processes, in particular for timelines, depending on how fast you want to get Braze up. Some email validation, which may have to do with DNS records like DKIM or SPF records. Email authentication as well, importing your email list, some SSL, and so forth, right? So there's all these things that are needed just to set up this one specific channel for email. And some of them may take a few weeks. Some of them may require other kind of integrations. Generally, they're not complex. They're just lengthy, might be the best way to describe them. It's little details that have to be done. They have to be ensured they're done correctly. They're going to be pitfalls, especially, for example, if you don't warm up an IP address and you start to send data from it. So there's all these different things that you sort of need to get ready for, and you can work with Braze on some of those things to get them done right. But just want to double check all those settings for that specific channel. If you look at push notifications, just as another example, typically we have setups that are different on Android versus iOS. We have to sort of capture tokens and register them and store them and things like that. So again, double check the channel settings, look at them and go through them and just work with the appropriate developer to get the specific channels set up. Let's now jump into the interface itself and kind of understand what's going on here. So I'm going to log in, and this is the homepage right now in one of my accounts. So we can see some basic metrics here at a glance, monthly active users and daily active users, some metrics down here. We can look up perhaps email metrics, and look at some of the deliveries and clicks and opens and things like that, hide some things and make some things less obvious. Let's also look at the data settings. So how some of this data will appear here if you go kind of connect all of this back to your tracking plan. So we have custom events, right? So again, this is the custom events from our tracking plan, the custom data we're sending into this specific account. We can't see the event properties here. There's a couple of ways to see them, but only the event properties we have enabled. But nonetheless, they are being ingested by Braze. So keep in mind that that data is being captured. And we have, of course, custom attributes that we're sending. Again, another 45 or so, just like custom events. Whether some strings, or we may have entire sort of arrays that we're sending here as a custom attribute that we can use. So this is the custom data from the tracking plan. This is how it's going to appear inside Braze. There's, of course, other things that Braze offers in terms of data, like email opens and clicks and sends. You're not going to see this here. This is just the custom data that your team has set up. Let's also look at a specific user and kind of look at how a user profile looks like, because I think a lot of the functionality in Braze kind of revolves around user profiles and their activity. So let's look at that. Okay, so here's a user profile in Braze. We have a user ID, we have our name. I am hiding some things like email, so you're not going to see those. Nonetheless, we have some of the attributes here, some session information that Braze is tracking across all the apps, all the SDKs that we have implemented, custom attributes that we may have, right? Any devices that this has been used on. In my case, it's been Mac. Perhaps just different, two variations of Mac. Then we have custom events. Again, we don't see the event properties here, but we have the custom events being tracked. And purchases, which is just a special way of tracking data in Braze. It's not an event, it's just a kind of its own little object. So you can track purchases. And if you have tracked purchases, then you have a few other things that are enabled for you around conversions for canvases and a few other things. Then we have some engagement around, contacts and cards and things like that. This user hasn't really received any messages. This is just my test user. And if there's any kind of messaging history, it will also appear here. Again, I don't think this user has received messaging in the last 30 days. So I don't think anything will load here. Yep, as expected. So again, from a debugging perspective, a technical implementation perspective, after you implement everything and you kind of open your app and you play around with it as a user, you should be able to find yourself here using your email address or your user ID if you have it. And then all the data here should make sense, right? You should see all the attributes that you should be expecting around first name and last name and any custom attributes. The email should be here if you're passing that. You should see that this user should be enabled for push notifications and email notifications. You can see down here, right, that this user is actually unsubscribed from email, but it can be subscribed, and they are subscribed to push notifications and a few other things. So you should be able to see all that in a single profile and make sure that all the data makes sense. This is sort of success from a technical implementation perspective. And then as you get real users, you can sort of spot check them to make sure that all the data appears correctly for that individual user. Any subscriptions, any purchases, anything that they have done since Braze was implemented should appear here in some shape or form. Let's look at segments too. Segments is the way that we can start to create groups of users that we're going to use in all kinds of things, or canvases or campaigns or anything else. So we look at segments, but specifically I want to show you how to create a new segment and some of the logic that's available to you. Okay, so we're here in the create. I gave it a name, just the test segment, just for our purposes here. We can add a little description if we so want to. Tags if you're trying to organize your segments. Then we have all the apps that are available here. You may have a web app, iOS app, Android app, analytics tracking, as you can see, right? So we're going to be able to track user behavior like sessions, purchases, custom events. This is limited to only 25 segments, as we can see in this pop-up. Again, double check your contract, depending on what's available for your account. And then here we have the segment builder. The logic here is sort of drag and drop. So we can do lots of different things, right? We have custom attributes that we saw before. So perhaps we go take, any kind of custom attribute here, right? Like total payments is more than 0, which means any user with any, 1, 2, 3, 4 will be captured here. We can add another attribute here, perhaps another custom attribute. This is a new user with a value of true or false. This is a Boolean attribute. This can be or, it can be and, right? And we can sort of keep adding things. Now they're going to match. So the next one has to be and as well. So if you had a third and a fourth one, they're all going to be ands or and. If you want to do, for example, 2 attributes or something else, then we can add another filter group. And in this case, we can do or. And now in here, we can come in and do something else, right? Again, some of the things you can see, we can add users who belong to other segments. I sometimes find it helpful to create what are called sort of universal segments. These are all our monthly subscribers. These are all our annual subscribers. These are all the churn users, that kind of stuff. And then those segments get reused in lots of other sort of permutations, but we don't have to redo the logic for what it means to be a monthly subscriber. We can do it once and reuse it. We can do custom events. So, any custom event that we did pass. And there's a couple other things to keep in mind. So it could be a custom event all time. So, show me users who signed up more than once ever. Or perhaps you want to do some logic over specific days. Show me users who signed up over the last 30 days, or show me users who made at least one purchase over the last 30 days. That's what sort of the X and Y means. We have sessions. So we can look at, session count, first session, last session, so on. Again, Braze tracks this typically out of the box from all the SDKs, or at least the majority of the SDKs. Some retargeting, some subscription behavior, again, for specific channels, some purchase behavior, again, if you are tracking purchases, demographic data, if that's available, specific apps, uninstalled devices, location, and again, a few other things. You can see there's quite a thing here. There's quite a few options here that are available in our segment builder. And again, right, we are our criteria, our filters, one filter group or multiple filter groups as we are here. We can add exclusion groups, which makes it red. I don't think this is the best interface, if I'm honest. I remember when I first saw it, it didn't quite make sense. Now, I get it. So we can exclude users based on the same activity as before, whatever that might mean. We can double check that the segment makes sense. We may have some users in mind, so we can kind of run their IDs here, just their external user ID or Braze ID. But of course, you can open the profile with an email and then get the Braze ID or the external user ID, run it, and then it will tell you if that user actually matches the segment or not. Some insights around this segment. And then once you build this, then you can send me some historical membership here, some API identifiers. And down here, it kind of gives you an amount of reachable users on the different channels you have available. In this case, in this account, we have email, iOS push, and Android push available. And if you do calculate exact statistics, once you save it, it typically then just gives you very accurate numbers. Typically, these numbers are estimates, and they tend to be pretty good. in my opinion. But if you want down exact numbers, so this number that says 231 might become somewhere lower. You can see this actually plus or minus about 1,000 subscribers. So that's sort of the range here. So again, it might be 232, it might be 230. The exact statistics might show you what those numbers are. And some of the additional statistics here, just some of the percent of the workspace of the users who are available. LTV, if you have that, typically LTV comes from purchases and some other tracking mechanism. So double check that. So those are segments, right? Very powerful way. You're typically going to create lots of segments. It's helpful to have those universal segments, so you're not recreating that logic over and over again. So think about that. But generally creating segments and then using the segments in lots of different ways is pretty straightforward. Once you have all the data in, right? Once you have the events, the event properties, if you're using that, the user attributes, the sessions, all the SDKs, everything is working properly, then building segments is really just a matter of minutes and defining the right criteria. Let's move on to canvases to show you. I think canvases is one of the main functionality here in Braze. This is where you can do some of the logic, like if-then logic. If a user did this, then send that email. If not, then send something else or send this push notification. So let's look at just something simple here. I won't show you every single setting for a canvas. I'm sure there's videos online that can show you all that. But once you have a canvas going, it kind of shows you how many messages are being sent, what the conversion rate is. Typically, you define events for a specific canvas, maybe a conversion event like a session or any of your custom events that you set up, or of course, a purchase of some kind. So we have events, and down here, if we collapse this a little bit, we start the user, we have the steps. This happens after 30 minutes. Then we go into the next step. Then here is the day one. Then there's a delay, again, a delay of 1 day. Then it goes to the next step. And then the day two. And then it goes into another delay of 2 days. And it goes into this step. This step is actually doing some filtering here. You can see this is, log workout more than 0 times. So if they entered yes, if not, if they have yes, then they are leaving this segment altogether. They're leaving the canvas. And if they say no, they're continuing on to this day, which again, an iOS push. There's another delay and so forth, right? You can kind of build this as you see fit with all kinds of logic and complex things. Typically, every step is something specific. So it might be a message of some kind, a push notification, an email. You may have filters that are kind of function very much the same as segments. You're filtering based on user attributes or events or anything else. You can filter on specific segments. So does a user belong to this segment or not? And then the message, and then you go through the canvas and so forth, right? So again, lots of things that can be said about the canvas, but this is the way you're building automations here in Braze with the data you have available and all the different sort of building blocks, the different channels, the different events, the properties, the user attributes, and you're coming up and ending up with something like this, where you can see all the steps down the line with the different logic that you're working with. One more thing, you do have campaigns. Campaigns are typically sort of standalone messages that you might send. They kind of function very similar to canvases in the way that you have logic for how to send it, who to include, then the actual message design itself. And then, for the message design sort of windows, it's kind of what you expect, right? You can design your push notifications, you can design your emails, you have ability to do an HTML or to use custom code. So lots of different things. And there is other functionality here I'm not covering because, there's only so much time we have in the video. But I want to show you analytics next, just for a quick overview. And we're going to look at email performance. You can build your own reports here. You can do reports based on custom events and a few other things. And you have this email performance data that's sort of built out of the box. I find it helpful to kind of build reports inside Braze, because then you can look at canvas and the conversion for that canvas, and the data can be quite accurate. I have built Braze reports elsewhere in other projects, for example, using Mixpanel or using Amplitude, which is another possibility if you use those tools and you want to consolidate all your reports. But nonetheless, Braze does have some reports built in out of the box, and you can build some custom things showing your data and showing what's going on with your canvases and your campaigns and the conversions. Again, typically the tricky thing is not so much to build the reports, but to ensure that you have all the different builder blocks. So when you run a canvas, you're properly tracking the conversion for purchases or the conversion for subscriptions. And as long as you have that, then the canvas will be able to report things properly. Sometimes you have funky design of canvases that can throw away the numbers, but you'll see those as you design them. So we do have some data here. These are some basic way to create reports and dashboards. Not as extensive as what you might find somewhere else, like a Data Studio Looker or Tableau or something like that. You can take your Braze data to like a Snowflake or a data warehouse, so you always have the possibility of doing that if you prefer. But if you want charts and reports in a sort of easy format, the Braze dashboard will give you that. And the last thing I want to show you is just the partner integrations. So there is all these kind of partners that can either bring data into Braze or it can receive data from Braze. I cannot go through every single partner, but again, some of the things we talked about before, there's the data warehouses, there's, AppsFlyer, mobile attribution, branch, we're going to see Mixpanel here, we're going to see amplitude. So there's a lot of different integrations. Every integration has its own details for what it means to integrate this tool with it. So you have to double check what that is. For example, this account has Mixpanel set up. So in this case, we're actually exporting data to Mixpanel. So we're taking all the Braze events, the email open, email clicks, email sends, push notification open, and that kind of stuff. There's quite a bit of events actually. We can see them all here. So we're taking all these events, whether this is 20 events, 25 events, and we're sending them to Mixpanel. We make sure that Braze and Mixpanel are integrated. That is, they use the same user IDs, so that Mixpanel is able to ingest this data, connect it to the right Mixpanel profiles, and then in Mixpanel we kind of use them to build funnels and things like that. So this is just one simple integration for data out of Braze into another platform, and of course we can take data into Braze from Mixpanel. I believe actually it's one option, and many other options. And you just want to make sure what that syncing looks like. But very handy way. I actually think in particular if you have data elsewhere, for example, if you actually went through the tracking plan process and you implement the data in somewhere like a Mixpanel or Amplitude, you can then bring in some of the data into Braze, and it might save you a big chunk of your implementation time. You still have to go through some of the channel setup, SDK setup, and things like that. But this might be one way where you can fast track some of your implementation if you've already done some of this work elsewhere. So keep that in mind as you think about how to best integrate Braze. Lastly, let's talk about pricing really quick. Again, all the pricing in Braze is custom, so I can only give you rough guidelines, but it will all depend highly on what your deal will look like. This website here, a vendor actually kind of keeps track of some of the pricing. We can see here that depending on your organization, it might be somewhere between 43,000 to perhaps 282,000. It's quite a wide range, though it depends on your size of the organization, of number of employees, and of course what data you have available, how much events, how many data points you'll be consuming, how many people will be using the account, what kind of features do you want, and so forth. So this is just rough guidelines, but just so you know that everything's custom in Braze. Generally, I would expect Braze that you're going to be starting somewhere in the 30, 40K a year and going up from there. So just have the right expectation. But Braze is a really powerful tool. So you're unlikely to need another tool besides Braze, because I think it has almost everything you need from a communications platform. So it's a very powerful tool. Just a final note on pricing that you may be interested in. That's all we have for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Of course, we talked about the tracking plan. We talked about SDKs, channels, interface demo, everything else you might be needed to understand what this Braze implementation looks like. It's a bit of a long video, but even then we cannot really fully cover everything. So I hope you found it useful. My name is Ruben. If you're looking for a next video to watch, I actually recommend you watch this video that talks about how to turn data into insights, which is very handy when it comes to your communication, because now you have a bunch of data points, how you actually turn it into kind of actionable insights that, in the case of Braze, will actually likely become messages, whether onboarding messages or transaction messages or something else. So I'm gonna put that video here so you can check that out. I think it's a great next step if you're looking for something else to up-level your Braze implementation. And until next time, we will talk soon.